So good morning everyone, and thanks for coming along to this seminar, and thanks to the AIESEC organisers for inviting me to come and present to you. So I'm going to talk to you, we've got an hour, and not a lot of you, so we can have a discussion. But I'm going to talk about aid, foreign aid, and tell you a bit about aid, and then towards the end also talk about career opportunities, thinking that you're all young people, well, you're all students, right? Thinking about what to do next. So try and convince you to think about aid as a possible career path, because it is a very exciting time, especially in Australia, to work in aid. So I hope it links in, more or less to your overall conference theme, which is about leadership. Successful aid and development is all about leadership. So I think that's probably all I'm going to say about leadership, but I think it does tie into your theme. I'm over at the Crawford School, and but I've actually only been there the last few years, and I've spent most of my life actually working in aid. I've worked for an NGO, Oxfam, I've worked for the World Bank, I've worked for AusAid, so I've seen a lot of aid from a lot of different points of view, and it's a fascinating career full of excitement and frustration as well. Never boring. Alright, I'm just going to give you some background first, and then we'll go on to more of the career element, and I hope this is what you've come to hear. If it isn't, you can ask me questions and I'll try and talk about something else. Right, this is a bit of an unusual screen angle, just to make it a memorable seminar. Normally we come here to eat, but now it's a meeting room. So what are we talking about? When we talk about aid, we're talking about international aid. Of course, there's a lot of domestic charity work, but I'm focusing on the international dimension, and it's a rough guess, but overall it's about 170 billion. So it's a big, think of it as an industry, it's a sizable industry, and it's made up of these four main types. There's a lot of jargon in aid. So first bit of jargon, and the biggest chunk of aid is called DAC bilateral. So DAC is the OECD, it's a couple of rich countries, and aid is traditionally something given by rich countries to poor countries. And that's about $73 billion annually coming from rich countries directly to poor countries. Then there's another 28, which is called multilateral. And what that is where countries don't give funds directly, but they give it to specialized institutions. Right? Aid's a complex business, so it makes sense to have some specialized organizations, and these are things like the World Bank, or the Asian Development Bank, or all the United Nations agencies. So they're responsible for another 28 billion. Then we have aid given from what we call emerging or non-traditional donors. So aid is not only something the rich countries do. Increasingly, everyone gives aid actually. Right? So China started giving aid, India gives aid, Brazil gives aid, even Indonesia gives aid. We have now an interesting phenomenon: countries both receiving and giving aid at the same time. And anyway, it's a fairly small amount, about 10 billion, but we're expecting this to grow, right? Especially as China becomes more and more powerful. We're going to see more aid from China. Well, that's all government aid, and the last chunk of aid is private or philanthropic, right? And that's things like Oxfam, World Vision, Save the Children. You must have heard of them, right? But also some new organisations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Right? These are the new big philanthropic organisations that are coming along. We're yet to see Australians really, the rich Australians embrace this, but the rich Americans are very influential donors. So that's about another 60 billion. So overall, in its different forms, it's $170 billion. Will you do that? Yeah, great. Okay. So just to give you, I don't know if you can see this figure actually, you probably can't, but these are the actual donors. So the blue ones are those OECD donors, rich countries. They're the biggest ones, right? China, we're not quite sure the estimate, but it's somewhere around this level. And then these orange are the NGOs. So like World Vision gives about as much aid as Australia put together, right? So these NGOs have become very big by clubbing together, the World Vision US, World Vision Australia, World Vision UK. You put it all together, and they're very sizable donors. And there's the Gates Foundation. So again, the Gates Foundation gives not quite as much as Australia, but not too far short. So some of these non-OECD donors, private foundations, NGOs, are quite sizable, and they're moving down. Right? With these blue ones, we're all facing fiscal stress, economic crisis, so we're not seeing a lot of growth in traditional aid. So over time, you're going to find this much more mixed up and interspersed. Okay, go to the next one. So we have the best data on what we call DAC or OECD bilateral aid. Right? That's because all the OECD countries report their aid every year to the OECD using the same format. So we have the best data on them, and this just gives you a long-term view of aid from 1960 through to last year, or 2 years ago, 2010. And here's the blue line. It's pretty much steady or going up until the 90s, it falls, and then we've had this big aid boom in the last decade. Right? This is a little spike, but overall we've had a big aid boom. So anyone want to try and explain the shape of that graph, and maybe why did aid start falling in the 90s and then rise again in 2000? You get the shape, right? It falls and then rises. Any guesses why that is? Yeah.
Because of the policies of World Bank, structured adjustment policies?
Yeah, well, policies did change over time, but that would affect the sort of type of aid rather than the amount of aid. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the Asian financial crisis was here, so that actually, which is pretty much after that, aid started to go up, so it might have helped some recovery. Did you?
Oh, well, I was just going to suggest world issues at the time. So I'm not sure because I was a kid during the 90s, but like maybe. So like I'm not sure if there are any wars or like any sort of public.
Yeah, so what happened in the 90s? We had the Asian financial crisis in 97. Yeah, what else happened in the 90s? That's the right approach.
Yeah.
Aid is related to the events of our time. What happened in the 90s?
The
Cold
Gulf
War.
War. Gulf War.
What happened to the Cold War? Oh, Gulf War. Is it? Yes, Gulf War. We had the Gulf War. Yeah, what other wars?
Well, we had the Soviet bloc disintegrating.
Right, so we had the end of the Cold War. So that was around here, right? Around this time. So we had the end of the Cold War. So aid, it's partly given for philanthropic reasons because we want to alleviate poverty, but it's also a strategic instrument. And aid has always been driven by strategic considerations. And in the 70s and 80s was driven very much by the Cold War. Right? So the US gave aid to its allies, and the Soviet Union gave aid to its allies. So when the Cold War ended, there was no reason to give aid, or not to give aid. And so aid fell. So why did it start to rise again around the 2000? So one reason, other reasons why didn't it keep falling? Because the Cold War still ended, hasn't started again. Why have we seen a big aid boom last decade? Yeah.
Maybe because of the tsunami and earthquake and...
Tsunami, yeah, that's kind of a one-off event, but this is very... Yeah, there have been more disasters, okay, so that might be the one reason. Yeah, at the back.
Raising public awareness of it, especially disaster, and trying to get grassroots aid as well.
Yeah, that's true. This has been a kind of a long period of prosperity in the West, and there have been lots of NGOs that have come up, right, and said we should be more generous. You might have heard of the Millennium Development Goals. Anyone heard of the MDGs? Yeah, so the whole world's kind of agreed these are some basic development goals. So there's more interest in development, more campaigning. Yeah.
Fighting terrorism.
Yes, fighting terrorism, right? So September the 11th. Right, so the Cold War ended, but then we had September the 11th, right? And that became a real reason for giving more aid because we thought, same sort of thing as the Cold War, right? We've got to give these people aid, make them better off. If they're better off, they won't be so unhappy. If they're not unhappy, they won't come and kill us. Right? So, and there, of course, then there was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? After you invade a country, you have to help rebuild it, put it back together again. So yeah, we have seen a big aid boom. Actually, you can't see it from this graph, but if you look to 2012, we've just done some analysis, and it's pretty much come to an end now. And in fact, aid is starting to fall again, right? Because of the global financial crisis. Right? The countries are trying to cut back and find fiscal savings. So it is a bit of a end of the era for this boom. And just briefly, the green line, this is the ratio of aid to GNI. GNI is gross national income. Any of you doing economics? You might have heard of GNI, right? Sometimes it's called GNP. But it's basically a measure of how much we produce. And so it's a generosity measure. And in fact, it's it's fallen and then it's stayed pretty stable over time. Because of course economies have been growing as well. The United Nations target is actually 0.7. But we've never actually got near that target. We'll see a few countries have, but not as a whole. Okay, next slide. So this one, that's the whole world. This is for Australia, because that's where we live. So Australia is pretty interesting as well, I think, to look at our aid experience. So like the last graph, this is in constant dollars. That means we adjust for inflation. Once you take out inflation, you can see that aid in Australia is pretty flat, right, for 3 decades, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? In fact, there's a slight increase, but up and down, but overall very flat, until about 2000, right? And then we see aid really taking off very sharply, and it's sort of doubled, right? It was flat around 2 billion, and now it's at 4 billion. Right? So it's really, what's happened in Australia is very unprecedented, right? And we can see that percent of GNI, it's been steadily declining as the economy is growing, but now it's been reversed, and it's starting to go up as well. So why has aid been growing in Australia? Pretty much the same reasons we looked at worldwide. Right? We're worried about terrorism, but we also have some regional events. Right? They've also made us more generous. So someone mentioned the tsunami. We gave $1 billion to Indonesia. Then we had the independence of Timor-Leste. We had provided a lot of help to that. There was Solomon Islands was drifting into a civil war, and we intervened in Solomon Islands. So Australia is surrounded by what we call fragile states, right? Countries that are not doing very well, and which are a threat to regional stability. So that's pushed Australia's aid budget up. Plus we've had a lot of aid campaigning here, a lot of NGOs calling for more aid. And the plan is to see a lot more aid in the next few years. We'll come to that at the end. Okay, next slide. So this is just looking at the different donors. Of course, the US is by far the biggest, right? This is 26 billion. And then Germany, UK, France, Japan are the top 5 donors. So this is 2008 data. Australia's here, right? We're about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Actually, Australia's already moved up. We're at 10th place, actually, because we've been expanding our aid budget, plus the Australian dollar is much stronger. So this is all measured in US dollars. Okay, next one. And this is just looking again by different countries, but this time using that generosity index as a percentage of GNI. So actually the US is the biggest donor, but it's the least generous donor, right? Because its economy is so big. Right? So it's the biggest donor in dollar terms, but the least generous donor when you compare it to its output. Australia's hasn't been very generous typically. We're at 0.34, which is about the average for the total. Right? Here's the target of 0.7. And there are a few countries that hit that target, right? Sweden, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands. So they tend to be North European countries that take that target very seriously. We haven't. This is the total, the ratio for all of DAC. But the average country, this is like the typical country, right, gives 0.47. So we're well below the average, but we're going to get much closer to the average according to current plans. All right, well that's about aid in terms of who gives aid, but what about who receives aid? Right? After all, aid is meant to help countries, so who are the countries that actually receive aid? Well, so now we start to look at aid from that side, from the side of the receiving countries. And of course, aid goes to poor countries. Right? If you're Israel and you get aid from the US, or you're Japan and you get aid because you've had a tsunami, we don't count that. Right? Because when we define aid, we only look at developing countries. But not all developing countries get the same amount of aid, right? And you might know we talk about low-income and middle-income countries. Have you heard about that? Yeah. So we divide in fact, we divide the whole world, right, into low-income, middle-income, high-income. High-income is Australia. Right? High-income is the OECD. Right? Everyone else is developing, right? Low or middle. And middle-income countries are countries like China, Malaysia. Right? They're not rich countries, but they're well on the path to development. Low-income countries are countries that are still very poor. Right? So India has just gone from being low-income to middle-income. I think Bangladesh is a low-income country. A lot of the African countries, like Tanzania, Ethiopia, would be low-income countries. And then we have something called LDC, least developed countries, and they're the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the low-income countries are LDCs. So in terms of who gets aid, there are the four categories here. This is upper middle income. So these are countries that are still developing, but they're pretty well off. So for example, this would be Thailand or Malaysia. Right? So they get very little aid at all. Right? Then we have lower middle income countries, so countries that are like China, and they get about 30% of the aid, but most of the aid, about 60 to 70%, goes to low-income countries. So aid is directed to the poorest of the poor countries, and then about half of that goes to the least developed, which are the very poorest. So if you're a country like China or Thailand or even Mexico, Brazil, aid is not very important for you. But the poorer you are, aid tends to become more important. So if you just go to the next slide. So we take these three categories, low income, and then lower middle income, upper middle income, and we look at aid as a percentage of GDP or output for the recipient. Right, for upper middle income, it's basically zero, right? So aid's not that important, it's just not important, right, for countries like Thailand. Lower middle income, so this would be a country like, say, Indonesia, would be lower middle income. Aid's about 1% of GDP. You know, that's 1%'s a lot, right, for GDP, but still, it's not hugely significant. But then we look at these low-income countries, like Bangladesh or Tanzania, and aid is about 5% of GDP. And so 5% of GDP is a large amount of money. Your government spending might be 20% of GDP. So then 1/4 of your government spending will be aid finance. So aid is a lot more important for low-income countries than it is for middle income. Now, having said that, next slide. Yeah, aid is becoming less important, right, relative to other forces of globalization. So what is globalization? Globalization is a process of interlinking countries. How are countries interlinked? Either by trade or by foreign investment, right, financial flows, or increasingly by remittances, right, because workers are increasingly international. And if we look at these financial flows, I don't have exports because exports would be on a totally different scale again. But here's aid. So aid has been increasing more or less over time, but it doesn't look as dramatic when you compare it to the other factors, right? So look at remittances. Right? Remittances used to be smaller than aid in the 90s, but now remittances are twice, or in fact, almost 3 times as much as aid. Right? Foreign direct investment, where you have foreign companies investing in factories, has also come way above aid. And private debt, so pure financial flows, are very volatile, right? So here we have the big boom, and then we have the crash. But overall, they tend to be bigger than aid as well. So it is true that in an increasingly globalized world, aid is much less important than it used to be. And what the future of aid is long term is hard to say. If we in 50 years' time, we didn't have aid before the Second World War, right? So aid is a Second World War phenomenon. If another 50 years' time, will we have aid? I don't know. I might be out of a job, but by then I'll be retired. And I think, at least for you and your career, aid has a very strong future, as I'll come to. And if we just look at the next slide, I don't know if you can see this one, but aid is still very important for poor small countries, because these poor small countries tend to have the least access to those other globalization flows. So these are African countries, and I've just arranged them from those for whom aid is most important to those for whom aid is the least important, using aid to GDP as a So for some of these countries like South Africa or even Nigeria, aid is very insignificant really. But there are 21 countries where aid is worth more than 10% of GDP. Right? That is what we call aid dependency. Right? That's huge, right? If you remember I said the budget's only 20% of GDP, then aid is half of your budget. Right? And some of these countries, right, it's extraordinary, right? If Liberia, aid is 95% of their GDP. So for countries that are poor and small, aid is still very, very significant. And if we go to the next slide, look at Asia. Of course, Asia gets less aid than Africa. But even for some East Asian and Pacific countries, aid is also very important. So again, if you're Thailand, China, Malaysia, even Indonesia, right, aid is very small. But if you're Laos, People's Democratic Republic of Laos, aid is 10% of GDP. Tonga, Vanuatu, these are the small Pacific islands, right? Palau, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste. So there are about 10 countries, Cambodia, Laos, and then the Pacific Islands, where aid is very important in the East Asia and Pacific region. And this is the final point in terms of the numbers. You know, aid, you can't just gauge the importance of aid by looking at the numbers. Aid is particularly important to some countries, but its influence extends worldwide. And the importance of aid goes beyond the numbers to the ideas which are embedded within aid. If you think about any global problem, whether it's climate change, or bringing stability to Afghanistan, or responding to a natural disaster, all of these problems require aid. We have very few global instruments to solve global problems. Aid is one of the few that we have. And that's one reason why it remains so durable and so important. All right, let's just go inside the aid world. The aid architecture is very complicated. It takes a lifetime to really understand it. This is just to illustrate this. This is how you might think, if you were designing it today from scratch, how you might design a very efficient global aid system. You have rich individuals who are taxed by rich governments, and those rich governments would then pool their funds to provide them to specialized multilateral institutions. As I said, aid is a very complex business, so you give it to specialized agencies, and those agencies would then distribute the funds or the projects to poor governments, which would be big benefits to poor individuals. Right, so this is like a very idealized or centrally planned aid architecture. But then, on the next slide, this is how the aid world actually works, right? It's a lot more complicated than that, right? As Homi Karas says, there are 233 multilateral development agencies, 51 bilateral donor countries, several hundred international NGOs, and tens of thousands of national NGOs. And there are all sorts of aid flows in all sorts of different directions. So it's a very complicated world, full of different sorts of agencies and different types of aid flows. Just on the next, so what actually do we use aid for? We use aid for many different things. Right? From providing food aid when people are starving, to providing general budget support, right, where we just give a check to a government to spend as they want to. Although often with policy conditions, right? Someone mentioned structural adjustment. Right? Structural adjustment still goes on, and it's funds for policy conditions. Aid often funds physical construction paid for by the donor, implemented by the donor's contractor. But it would also include earmarked funds using government systems, where the donor provides the funds to the government, but not as general budget support, instead for specific projects, for example, to buy drugs for health clinics or textbooks for schools. A lot of aid is given in the form of technical assistance. A lot of aid finances experts who go to developing countries and provide their expertise in a particular area, whether it's auditing or legal services or drug procurement. And then scholarships. Right? I don't know if any of you are on an AusAid scholarship, right? But AusAid provides hundreds of scholarships just to the ANU and thousands a year in Australia, and that's also counted as part of aid. So aid is many different things going through many different agencies to many different countries, and that's why it's very difficult to evaluate whether it works. People often say, well, does aid work? Well, it's very difficult to answer that question because there are so many different types of aid given by so many different organisations to so many different countries. Anyway, that's mainly what I try and research, is whether aid works and what type of aid works. But rather than talking about that today, I'm going to take a more practical kind of turn and talk to you about, just finish off about careers, and then we can take any questions, have discussion. So let's say you're thinking about, you think, well, this is kind of interesting. Aid, there's a lot of money there, and maybe I can do some good. So how do I get into the aid business? Well, people enter the aid world really in two ways, in my experience. Either they come in as a graduate, so when they finish their study, and they work in an aid organisation for their career, or they come in as a mid-career specialist. So they gain some, not only academic training, but workplace skills, and then they're then able to transfer to the aid world, to transfer those skills they've gained typically in their career, which is normally in a developed country, but as I said, increasingly countries like China are also giving aid. But they transfer those established skills into the aid agency and onto developing countries. So you really get two chances to enter the aid world. One is after you graduate, or shortly after you graduate, and the other is mid-career, when you've already established yourself and then you're looking for a change. So for example, you become a very good architect, right? And but you're a bit tired of doing the same thing year after year, and then you notice that the aid agency is looking for an architect to work on a reconstruction project in Aceh in Indonesia, and then all of a sudden you have a massive career change. So those are the two ways you can enter. What are the opportunities? Well, these are the four main ones. You can apply for a bilateral aid agency, which in Australia's case is AusAid, and AusAid is expanding rapidly because our aid is increasing. AusAid has a graduate program. They hire graduates every year, and they also bring people in that mid-career. You can apply for a multilateral agency. Right? You can apply for the World Bank, or the ADB, or the United Nations, and there are others as well. I think if people are interested in these, just ask me during the questions, right, rather than going through each one. Now, you can work for an NGO, so you can get a job with World Vision, or CARE, or one of the many NGOs that operate in Australia, or you can get a job with a consulting company. Right? A lot of the funds, what does AusAid do with its money? It gives some of it to multilateral agencies, it gives some of it to NGOs, but some of it spends on its own projects. Right? But AusAid doesn't have the staff to implement all of its own projects, so it hires consulting companies, right? And they in turn have specialists, or they hire specialists in different areas, whether it's construction, or often it's provision of expertise. Right? They might want a project on tax reform, and they're looking for tax specialists, right? Or a project on domestic violence, and they want health workers or social workers to work with women who are at threat of domestic violence. A whole range of specializations, and there are these companies that whose business it is to recruit experts. So that's the other avenue you can take, is to work for a consulting company. Okay, next one. Well, what do you need to get a job? I think it's pretty much the same with any of these, right? Whether it's AusAid or United Nations or World Vision or Coffees, they're all pretty much looking for the same things. So what do you need to get a job in the aid world? Well, first of all, you need a skill, right? You've got to have some identified skill, even if you come in at the graduate level, right? It's good to have some sort of skill that you can, some sort of expertise that you've gained at university, or perhaps in a couple of years of work experience. Obviously, if you're coming in at the mid-career level, then that's your main selling point, But even at the graduate level, it's good to have some sort of discipline, and I'm sure you've all got that through your university studies. Right? So I'm an economist. Economics is in high demand by aid agencies because economists are used to evaluate projects, to do cost-benefit analysis on projects, but they're also used to explore policy reforms. Right? And a lot of aid is trying to help countries implement policy reforms that will improve their development prospects. Then health and education, engineering. So a lot of aid gets spent on health, education, and on infrastructure. So these kind of specialist skills are really essential for a aid organisation. Anthropology. A lot of aid is working with local communities, and you need to have people who understand how these communities function. And then private sector skills, I think, or private sector and government skills, right, are very useful skills to have. So the first thing is you need some sort of skill, a degree, which you'll all get. Second thing is overseas experience. So this is often a dilemma because you want to get into development, but then they ask you, well, have you got overseas experience? But you can't get overseas experience until you get into development, right? How are you going to get overseas? So this is often a barrier entry. How do you get that first round of overseas experience? Well, there are several ways. At least this is, in Australia. There's something called AYAD, the Australian Youth Ambassadors. I don't know what the D is. Development. Australian Youth Ambassadors, and they don't require overseas experience, right? They're intended for people to get that overseas experience, and they're anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, and you'll get placed in a country and doing a job of your interest. You won't earn a lot of money, but you'll get that overseas experience. If you're an economist, there's something called ODI, Overseas Development Institute, and they run ODI fellowships, which are specifically targeted for postgraduate economists to get development experience, which they can then use to start a career in development. So if you're an economist, that's a really good scheme to look out for. And then the third option is just do it yourself, just take off, right? Go and volunteer somewhere, right? Go and travel, just get some experience. You never know who you're going to meet, right? And what it's going to lead to. So, aid and development is about taking a few risks. So if you can't get an organised kind of experience, just organise it yourself, right? Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that AIESEC ANU, AIESEC ANU also offers overseas exchanges for global community development programs. So if you're interested, also come to us. Yeah.
Great. So
yep.
Yeah. So put AIESEC. Yeah, and there are lots of groups that will help you do some volunteering. And you go overseas for a couple of months, you never know what it's going to lead to. Right? You'll meet someone there, they'll invite you back, they'll ask you to stay on, and that could be the start of your career. So yeah, this is getting the first step, getting up to the first rung on the ladder. Right? It's not easy, but trying to get overseas experience. The other way is through your studies, right? If you do some sort of postgraduate study, then often that can involve research overseas or study overseas. That's another way to get overseas experience. Next one. So what else do you need? I think it's good to have a foreign language. Right? So if a second language, whether it's depending on the country, if it's Bahasa, you work in Indonesia, or one of the Pacific languages, Pidgin, French if you're going to work in Africa. So a second language is good. Contacts are important. So a lot of development is about networks and it's about who you know. So if you're interested in development, I think you want to meet people. You want to study development. You want to go to events, go to seminars, and just try and meet people. Try and network. Networking is very important. Of course, you've got to be interested in it. Not everyone's interested in development and aid. It can be a very frustrating business. It can often require long travel and separation from your family. Of course, it's fascinating, but you've got to have a certain drive and determination. I think it's not. It's an area where you get. If it was easy, every country would be developed and rich. So it's not an easy area. It can often be very traumatic, right? You can be dealing with very poor people. You can be dealing with people who are really suffering after an emergency, after a disaster. It can be highly stressful. So it's not for everyone, but it does have high rewards. And if you're interested, this is the website we run, which is more about development policies. If you want to read about development policy debates, that's a good entry point. That's our website, or our blog. And this one I mentioned, this is run by a group of young people in Sydney who have themselves sort of just started out on a development aid career, and they want to, they found it difficult, I guess, but they're getting there. They're trying to make it easier for other young people to find out about development opportunities. So this is a good networking website, which I recommend to you. And you can contact the website if you're interested. And then just finally, so why should you consider this a career right now? Well, it is a very exciting time in Australian aid, and what I've said, the long term, 50 years time, we don't know what the aid world's going to look like. If we're thinking the next 5 years or the next 20 years, there's going to be a lot of aid in Australia. So I mentioned to you that aid's already increased, right, from 2 billion up to 4 billion. That was in 2010. In 2011, it went up to 4.8 billion. Then they've just had, this budget that was a couple of weeks ago. It's 5.1 billion. But the plan of the government is to get to 0.5 of GNI by 2016. Right? It was 2015, but they delayed it by a year. You might have seen some of the media around that. And it's not clear they're going to get there. Right? They may not get to 0.5, especially if the coalition government is elected, and maybe they've got to find some more savings in the budget if they get rid of the mining tax, for example. But even if we don't get here, we have seen, and we're going to keep seeing big increases in aid. Right? So even if we don't get to 9 billion, we can see maybe we'll be at 7 or 8 billion in 2016. So the entire aid world in Australia, which has been pretty quiet, remember it was flat around 2 billion for 3 decades. Last decade it really took off, and it's keeping on increasing. So there are going to be lots and lots of new jobs for you all. So it's a good time to think about a career in aid in this country in particular. That's all I had prepared. Thank you. And we've got some time, so if we have time for questions?
Yeah.
Yeah? Any questions or comments? Yeah.
What about people studying communication, or do you need students from that area? What type of job do you, aid offers?
In communications?
Yeah.
Well, every aid organisation has a communications outfit, and it's for an NGO, it's essential because they rely on fundraising. So you've got to tell the good stories, right? These are the results we're achieving. You've got to convince the public that give us your money and we will deliver some real results. Right? We'll change people's lives with your money.
So it's not only for economics students?
No. I mean, there's a wide no. I just think it's so I mentioned economics. That's because I'm an economist. But yeah, health and education, engineering. But yeah, communications is another skill that they're looking for. So yes, aid is about development. Development is about everything. And there's no area that's left out of development. I'm just saying it's good to go in with a specific skill that you can offer to the aid agency. So if you've got a general degree in science or in arts, I mean, I did my first degree in arts. I think arts is a great foundation. But then you want to go on and do something, right? Something that's more applied. So I did economics after that. So yeah, a general degree like arts or science, it's probably not enough to get you into an aid agency. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. I mean, most people now would go on and do a postgraduate degree, some sort of master's, economics, public policy, environmental management. Those are the ones we offer at Crawford. International relations, communications. Yeah, but if you've got an engineering degree, you might not need to do that master's degree. But you want some sort of applied skill. Yeah.
Are there any masters or anything specifically in development?
Right, that's a good question. At ANU, you mean?
Yeah, because recently we've been getting more development courses. Like when I started, we didn't have that many, but they've been increasing. So
Really?
is there opportunities?
Right. There.
Masters of
Yeah, there are. There's something called the Masters of Applied Anthropology and Participatory Development, which is a long title. It's MAA-PhD. No, MAA-PD. And that is about community development, right? So that's about sort of NGO-focused work, right? Working with grassroots community, maybe doing things like microfinance. Right? So you've got that, that's at one level. And then you've got what we offer, which is the Masters of International Development and Economics. So that's looking at it at a macro level from an economics perspective. And then you've got a Masters in Public Policy, where you can specialize in development. Right? So that will give you, again, at the macro policy level, but not with such a heavy economics focus. So yeah, there are a few degrees at the policy level and at the community level that you can look into here at the ANU. Yeah.
I kind of wanted to move away from the career side of things and ask you about your own specialisation. So what factors do you think influence the successful implementation of aid? And just now when you answered that question, you said that aid leads to development. Seemingly most of the time, well, from past experience, it doesn't really kind of have that direct route. So how do you think we can increase the utilisation of aid so that it does, most of the time at least, lead to development?
Right,
Rather than create a cycle of dependence.
Right. Well, that's a very good question. And it's not an easy one to answer in a short period of time. So I run a course on that. And yeah, it's a difficult issue. So I think, but it's a very important question, because obviously, if it doesn't really work, well, then what's the point of having a career? You might earn some money, and it'll be interesting, but will you really feel you've achieved anything at the end of the day? So it is a very important question. And you asked two sort of questions within that.
Yeah.
Both of them important. So one is, well, does it work actually? What is the track record of aid? Well, we've got a lot of evidence, because people have been studying this for a long time. Naturally, ultimately it's taxpayers' money. Taxpayers are giving, and private individuals giving even more. $100 billion plus a year. They're going to want to know whether this works. So there have been a lot of studies, and the overall result is mixed. Mixed, I think you've got to say. I think if I had to, summarise it myself, I would say that on average it does work. On average, it does work. So we shouldn't, in my view, we don't need to despair. Right? On average, we've seen that aid has helped countries. And the reason I say that, in summary, is that even while some countries have had a lot of difficulty growing, they're still very poor. If we look over the post-war era, we have seen huge increases in life expectancy. Right? People live for about 20 years longer than they did in the 60s today. And a lot more people go to school, a lot more people read. Probably, life literacy has gone up from below 50 to 70 to 80%. Now, some of that is done by countries themselves, but aid has played an important part in financing schools, financing drugs, in getting new drugs out to poor countries. So, if we just look at the track record, we can see that overall aid has played, I think, on average, a useful role. But you mentioned aid dependence, and they're certainly right. Aid can have that, unintended consequence, right? And actually run the risk of doing more harm than good. Right? It can prop up really bad governments. Right? It can lead to a lot of corruption. Right? Governments fight to get the aid rather than focusing on development. So there are risks with aid, and aid by no means achieves its full potential. So that would be a very quick answer to the first question. The second one is, what can we do to improve it, and how do we make it work better? And that's a good question, because we know there's going to be aid in the future. Whether it works or not, how can it work better? It's a very practical question. I always look at it under three headings. One is the recipient government. Ultimately, it's the government in the developing country, whether it's Bangladesh or Indonesia, that is either going to use that aid effectively or waste it. So anything we can do to help that recipient government improve its own performance. I think that's one avenue. Second avenue is looking at the donor agency, AIESEC or the World Bank, right? What can they do to be more effective? And there what we've been stressing is the importance of transparency and aid evaluation. Because the problem with aid is, no one knows if it doesn't work, right? It's like if you think about your garbage collection, right? If your garbage isn't collected on Friday, or whatever day it is, then you can call someone up in the ACT government, you can complain, right? And eventually your garbage will be collected. But if you live in Papua New Guinea and there's meant to be an AIESEC project to fix your road, and it gets delayed or the money is stolen, then who do you complain to, right? Like there's no phone number, right? You're in the middle of the bush, and even if you get through to AIESEC, you don't vote in Australia, right? So ultimately, the beneficiary doesn't really have a strong voice. So that's the weakness of aid is what we call this weak or broken performance feedback loop. So anything that can improve performance feedback, get more transparency, more evaluation, so we know whether the aid's working, I think is going to help. So it's the quality of the donor, the quality of the recipient, the quality of the donor, and the third thing is the interactions between the two. One of the problems with aid is that there, as I mentioned, there are like 283 multilateral donors. So for a small country, they get overwhelmed, right? Everyone wants to come and do good. They all do their own project. And, the poor government is totally overwhelmed by just dealing with the donors. So donors need to cooperate a lot more and put less of a burden on the government. But anyway, that's a very brief answer to that question. I mean, those are very good questions. And if that's another important part of aid. That it's why I decided to get out of aid and become an academic, because I thought we need more people who are outside of aid who have an interest in it, right, and who kind of keep an eye on what's going on. Because aid is very much an insider-outsider business. The insiders are really well informed, they know what's going on, but they don't say anything because it's their job, right? And then the outsiders, they've got no idea, right, what's really happening to aid. So we do need to have a more informed debate about what sort of aid works, which projects are good, which are bad. And we need to build up the research community, the academic community that actually works on aid, especially in Australia, because this aid budget is increasing such a lot. So, good question, and that's only the start of an answer to it. Yeah?
I understand a big portion of the money goes to administrative costs from the aid money. So, what's the policy to minimize that administrative cost or the management?
Right. Yeah, well, it's always a debate, but it's not really a lot, right? It's normally about 5%. You've got to administer aid if it's going to be well used, right? If you just cut back on administration, right, then you might increase the risks of corruption, increase the risks of waste. For example, evaluation, right, is accounted as part of administration, right? So one way to cut back on administration is, well, let's not evaluate any projects. But then if you don't evaluate projects, you don't learn, right? So actually administration is an important part of aid, and in most big aid organisations, it's not very large. Where administration tends to be a problem is for a small organisation, right? Because the overheads tend to be fixed in aid, right? You've got to rent your office, right? You've got to have your communications expert. But, your overheads are more or less fixed, right? They don't increase as your aid program increases. So what you find is small donors and small NGOs tend to have high overhead costs. And yeah, that's because we've got too many donors, right? Everyone wants to set up their own NGO, right? We don't have... so there's an argument for consolidation. But overall, I think administration costs probably aren't a big issue for aid. Yeah.
I think I was going to front with his question where he talked about the usefulness of how useful aid is. I guess from what you've said, it's about the mode of delivery of aid. I think it's what I'm beginning to think that it might be more important, because I've worked with some programs where when you look at the per capita investment of the aid, you realize that the beneficiaries actually get less money compared to the amount of money that eventually goes back to the donor country. I'll give an example. I worked with an HIV program where we were asked to buy HIV test kits, HIV drugs from US companies. All our cards were supposed to be Ford cards. Well, each year we're getting about 6 expatriates. They're called CTOs, seated in Washington, Boston, trying to think about how much money was going in that particular area. I think was spending much more money there. They were spending much more money there. When somebody in the Ministry of Health tried to ask how much money was actually being spent on individuals, the person got fired. So I think certain programs or certain ways of delivering aid are less cost effective.
Yeah.
I kind of admire the AIESEC model, trying to invest in people, so that they can go back and do their own.
Well, AIESEC's also been criticised for this, and so in Australia or in the Pacific, it's called boomerang aid. Right? Is it boomerang? So the idea is, you give the aid, especially in PNG, they talk about this, right? We say we're giving aid to PNG, but actually the money goes to a consultant, right? And they spend most of it when they come back to Australia, right? So actually it's a boomerang, it comes back to Australia. So that's often used to criticise the aid program, in the same sort of way you've been talking about. I mean, I think it comes down to two things, right? One is, what you talked about first was that you've got to buy Ford cars, right? So it's tied. Sometimes aid is tied, right? You want our aid, you've got to use our consultants, Australian consultants. So that's not very efficient. And most countries are moving away from that now. So that's a good aid reform, is to untie the aid. And then the second thing is, well, is this consultant, if those 6 consultants you had, right, if they were really helping you and solving some real problems and making sure that services got to the people, then it would be a good use of money, right? But if they were not doing anything that was very useful, maybe they're writing reports that no one reads, then it's a waste of money, isn't it? So what I always think because basically you're talking about spending on money on consultants, and often foreign consultants, it comes down to value for money. Are they doing something useful? Right? That can be the most valuable form of aid. Right? I know in one of the best things Australia has done, it helped Indonesia set up a large taxpayers office. This was an office that went after, say, the largest 200 taxpayers, and really helped crack down on tax evasion and raise a lot more revenue for the Indonesian government. That was a fantastic return, right? For the few $100,000 you spend on consultants, you got hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So consultants can be enormously valuable, right? But they can also be a waste of money, right? And we've seen in the case of PNG, I've been critical of the Australian aid program for spending too much money on consultants who just wrote reports that no one read. So yeah, I wouldn't. I agree. So I'm agreeing with you. It comes down to the form of aid, but. No, let me put it this way. I agree with you, the form of aid is important, but you can't just say one form of aid is a waste. Right? You can't say, well, consultants are a waste of money. Right? You've got to look at each specific case and whether they're delivering value for money.